I'm a general practitioner or a family physician, depending on where you live as to what you say. I work part-time also in the discipline of general practice in Brisbane, University of Queensland, and that's in Australia. So basically we're going to do some work in this workshop, so everyone's going to be contributing some ideas by addressing the challenges and thinking about, you know, is illness in a doctor a special situation? Are doctors different is what the title is. So, you know, are they special? Are doctors special patients? Do doctors actually need special services and special support for their healthcare? Can a doctor actually be their own doctor? It's sort of a perennial question, and if so, in what capacity? Should doctors be permitted to prescribe every medication for themselves, only some or none? And do doctors actually need specially trained doctors to actually care for them? So these are the sort of issues that we'd like you to actually think about while we're actually doing some of the presentations from services that are available around the world. But also we'd like to just have you actually focus on some specific tasks later on in our workshop. Next one, please. I don't know that that's the next one. We'll find out. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, good. Okay. Yes. Okay, in Australia we have 6 states and 2 territories, and we actually have completely different services in every state and territory. You know, if you look at the size of the Australian Capital Territory, it's very, very small. So, you know, we have very different services in each state and territory. The history is that we also had very different regulatory bodies in each state and territory. So the services have actually emerged from the community of medical practitioners to actually address the needs identified in each community, and therefore they're actually different responses. These responses have been happening over the last 25 years, so the Doctors Health Service that I work in Queensland has actually been around for just over 20 years. It was one of the early ones started. And the approach has varied depending on the person who actually led the movement initially. It was sort of like someone identified their problem, gathered some friends, and it depended on whether they were psychiatrists, anaesthetists or whatever as to who they gathered around them, and eventually they would start leading the way with support from their college or the AMA or whatever, depending on where they felt comfortable within their professional bodies. So it was very different, but basically the focus was very similar because it was all about enhancing the health access for the doctors that needed help. In Victoria, we probably have the most sophisticated service. It's called the Victorian Doctors Health Program. It's a 24-hour call service as well, so it means that doctors can ring 24 hours a day and get to speak to somebody. But it assists doctors also to link to a GP. They have a list of GPs and they can say, where do you live? And this is who you can perhaps go and see if they're interested in treating doctors. It also provides a lot of educational support, so it provides the technological information required for medical schools to actually know about doctors' health, so that it's consistent teaching across a lot of the medical schools to some extent. And it also provides case management. It used to provide some treatment services, but there's very little treatment that happens now. It's predominantly, we let you get treatment out in the private sector, but we'll actually help manage your case. So it basically means that if the doctor is sort of having difficulties managing with the treating doctor, or the treating doctor is having difficulties managing with the doctor, there's a third party who can actually support that process to enable it to move on. So it helps the coordination of care, but it also helps the linkage, because at a certain point in time, if the doctor needs some rehab, for example, they fell off their motorbike and got major head injuries, and now they actually are back ready to go to work, how do they actually get back into work unless they're in a supported environment to make sure that they're A, safe, but also B, managing themselves, and so they can actually support that linkage. In Queensland, Western Australia, ACT and New South Wales, we have 24-hour call services. Some services actually train the doctors who take the calls. We provide some support for the doctors who take the calls, but don't do active training, and you can't do it unless you're trained. New South Wales has training for the doctors and allowed to take the calls until they're trained. And South Australia has a similar 24-hour call service. You have to actually be trained up to take the calls. But they also have an isolated clinic in the middle of Adelaide, which is the capital of South Australia. And that isolated clinic will actually see doctors usually after hours or on Saturday mornings.
Sorry, Margaret, but I think people working in a second language, you're walking quite fast.
I'm sure you're right. It's normal for me to speak fast when I'm really nervous. So the anxieties. That's right, thank you, Amanda, I appreciate your comment. So basically, in South Australia, they have that extra service. That's a new service, and we're yet to see how well it's taken up. They've only just had that open last year. So the evolving history is that there's been a slow awareness in each of the states and territories of the other service in the other states and territories, because they all evolved as very separate organisations. And it was recognised that there was also evolving services happening in other parts of the world, particularly America, with the American Medical Association ran a number of conferences before the international conferences started. And so Australians started to engage with that. And we decided, let's hold our own conference in 1999, and Queensland started that, and we were very proud of that, and it's been held every 2 years since then. And we now have a more formalised coalition of services called the Australasian Doctors Health Network, which includes New Zealand. And we have a vision that there should be a national approach for each of our communities, and that we should actually have a unified voice so that when people talk about doctors' health, they actually know who they can talk to, and when we talk about doctors' health, we know who we can talk to in amongst the states and territories. Now, there has been a massive change in 2010. We had a big overarching medical board established so that now Australia has one medical board. And with that legislation came in a thing called mandatory reporting, where doctors are actually mandated to report other doctors, not just professionally responsible to report, but actually mandated with legal consequences if we do not report. Since then we've seen a massive rise in vexatious reporting, dare I say particularly in Queensland. So people are actually reporting doctors because they actually want to work in the practice next door and they want to get rid of that other doctor. It was fairly inevitable that this would be happening, I suppose. Western Australia has an exemption so that the treating doctor does not have to report on the doctor. They still have the professional responsibility to report if they think it's unsafe, but they don't have the legal requirement. Queensland Medical Board has been inundated with reports and has not been able to manage and process the reports, and was just a couple of weeks ago disbanded by the Minister because it was totally ineffective. We now no longer have a medical board, we have an interim medical board, and we're going to get some sort of ombudsman, and it's very unknown what the consequences are going to be. And we certainly have had less GPs. A lot of our GPs resigned from taking call. They just said, we don't know how to cope with mandatory reporting, so we're not going to take the call anymore. And our calls are actually less, but also not only that, we're actually finding doctors are actually ringing with a different problem. They're not telling us about their health issue. They're saying, can you tell me about mandatory reporting? And it's sort of a bit hard to say, well, why do you need to know? But anyway. So the role of the Australasian Doctors Health Network is sort of still in evolution. We feel our services are very vulnerable. The funding is also vulnerable, but the Medical Board has just offered us some funding. We're feeling very uncomfortable with this because we're worried that if we have a connection to the Medical Board, who would ring our service, at the same time we have no funding from anywhere else. So we're trying to set up a structure to keep our distance. And obviously we have manpower issues. But we do have a conference in October in Brisbane, and I'd love everyone to come. It's the Professional Health Conference because we think that doctors' health and lots of other health professionals need to link together to understand the health issues. Thank you.